we certainly need to have an holistic vision of the people on the move, who is moving, from where and why. We also need to be aware that obviously definitions are important, because policy work by defining people, defining their status and entitlements, and so it's important also to pay attention to that. One thing which is often people forget, though, that categories like legal or illegal or undocumented, because if we don't want to use the term illegal, that is strongly criticized, are very much constructed from the state perspective. No? So, for example, I've done work with undocumented migrants in Britain for a number of years, and what is interesting is that they took a number of years to reach Britain, but large chunks of these journeys were perfectly legal. They were moving between countries with visas, without need of visa. They stayed for a long time in a specific country working, and then they try. So it's very not straightforward to identify someone and undocumented migrants. The other thing, which also, by focusing on the state, is a reminder of the fact that if the state change how they categorize people, someone who is legal may become undocumented from day to the other. Just to give you an example, up to the enlargement of the European Union to Central Eastern Europe country, like for example Poland or Romania, especially Romanian nationals were among the largest group of undocumented migrants in the European Union. Then with the enlargement, from one day to another, they became European citizens. So people didn't move. People were already in the country in many cases, but they were still basically the category, how they were defined, changed from one day to another. And this is happening now, for example, with Brexit, but it's also happened, for example, in the context of the so-called refugee crisis. When in 2013 there was the tragedy Lampedusa, where over 300 people died just off the shore of the island in the middle of the Mediterranean, the Italian island, there was a strong response from European and Italian civil society. There were specific sorts of circumstances as well. This was a time in which there was a new pope that was much more pro-migrant in Italy. There was a government which was unelected, so what they were technocrats. Somehow linked to Christian ethos. So there was a very strong response in terms of solidarity to this event, and Italy decided to launch an initiative like the Mare Nostrum search and rescue operation, and they, in 12 months they rescued over 150,000 people. No? So when there was this tragedy, and this was the beginning of what then became called as the refugee crisis, then obviously in 2015 we have the death of Alan Kurdi on the shore in Turkey, which then triggered the German Chancellor Angela Merkel to welcome all the Syrian refugees and to open what is called the Balkan route, etc. And in 1 month alone, in October 2015, we have I think over 200,000 people crossed reached from Turkey into Greece. So there was at that time a very strong response from European civil society. The NGOs became very active. New humanitarian actors started to do search and rescue operations, supporting in collaboration with the Italian authority, etc. What we saw as well was the growth in parallel, in the sense of anti-immigration political movement in a number of European countries. Even in a country like Italy, that in 2013 there was a very wide support for rescue operations vis-à-vis the people in the sea. Gradually, in the next 3-4 years, this changed radically. So what we saw here is that especially European authorities, the European Commission, start to worry about this shift, this emergence of the right-wing party, anti-European party, because quite soon a blame game started, which was basically accusing the European Commission not to do enough to stop the arrival, etc., or there was not enough solidarity between member states. And what happened was that the humanitarian discourse was gradually co-opted by the European member states, and this process was also done by gradually expelling or evicting the humanitarian actors from the theater of operation. So by this I mean, like, for example, it became more and more difficult for a search and rescue boat run by NGOs to work in the sea. We've seen a number of trials against a number of them. We saw the criminalization of Spanish firefighter, no, they were not firefighter, life support organization in Lesbos that became and got end up on trial. And so what happened at the time was it became more difficult for NGOs and civil society to participate. And gradually what happened is that the member states gained control of the narrative. And this process basically led as well to toughening up of the approach to search and rescue operation and the closure of the sea border in many ways. The migration crisis or the refugee crisis, and then how do we define it, actually makes a difference in a sense. It's has highlighted a large tension within the European project. We've seen a number of states blaming the European Commission for not doing enough in terms of protecting the European borders. Other states have been blaming other member states for not showing enough solidarity in terms of taking new arrivals and supporting them. So what we saw is that, especially from the perspective of Italy in particular, but also Greece, what was happening has always been constructed as a European problem. So people who were crossing the sea not to go to Italy or Greece, but to go to Europe, or in many cases to go to Northern European states, to Germany, Sweden, etc. Increasingly what happened was that the border between Italy and Greece and the rest of Europe has become harder. I mean, we have seen, for example, the suspension of Schengen for example, from between Italy and France, first formally and then informally. But also, for example, Austria, tension at the Austria-Italy border. So what we see now is this sort of, so while there is an understanding that this is mostly a European problem, but the fact that it's constructed a European problem is also important, because by being European is a way of also of revitalizing the European Union as a political project, as a form of community. If every state is by itself, in a sense, is also undermining the whole political project. So migration has become a way of a litmus test of these tensions within the European project. And this was partly why the position of the European Commission has become much tougher over the years since 2013. So they felt as if the borders was not sealed, and we know that this is never fully possible, this was potentially become a threat to the whole community. So cities have been playing an important role, especially when states start to become less involved or less happy to save people at sea. In the second stage, so in welcoming people once that's arrived in Europe, and they have had quite some visibility in doing that. Obviously, Barcelona has been one of the key actors, but also Palermo in Italy. There has been Berlin. There has been a network, in a sense, almost the birth of a network of cities around the refugee welcome movement, for example. So you have cities both in terms of local authorities that can play a role, but also city in terms of the civil society, the urban civil society that's done a big effort. I mean, if you think, for example, the case of the Canadian resettlement program, it's become quite a model of this partnership between the private sector and the local authorities in facilitated the process of integration of, for example, of Syrian families. The model has been put in place also in a number of countries. For example, in the UK now we have a community partnership program that enables families of refugees to find a community once they are moved into various towns and cities in the United Kingdom. But the number is small. So this project always gets a lot of visibility, but in reality they only manage to provide support for relatively small numbers. They're also fairly expensive to implement. The risk that I see sometimes is that some of these projects become like a fetish for local authorities, or especially for the state, for not doing much. So they say, oh, we got a nice little project and it's become discussed all over Europe, it's great, so we can sort of wash our hands from actually putting in place serious long-term policies of integration. What we need now, and if you think about, while yes, the arrivals through the Mediterranean are much smaller now, although there are some signs of tension at the border between Turkey and Greece, for example. But there is a challenge there, and there's still a challenge with the integration of those who came since 2013 and 14. I mean, still talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and that work is a long-term work, and you cannot only rely on civil society and volunteers. Because volunteers are very good for the short terms, but you need some sort of sustainable approach, which takes time, and we take the involvement of the state and the offices of local authorities, etc.